From New York City, the epicenter of the pandemic, this is Democracy Now!
There
was a young man that I know was still going to work, even though he said he had been sick for 2 weeks. I don't know why Tyson didn't detect that people who were sick were still going to work. This only made things worse. Later, I realized that a lot of people at that plant were infected. A man who worked there died.
At least 20 workers at meat processing plants have died from COVID-19. Around 5,000 have tested positive, though many don't have access to tests. But President Trump invoked an executive order to bar local governments from closing meat plants. We'll hear from meat workers about conditions during the pandemic and speak with the CEO of the League of United Latin American Citizens, or LULAC, which is supporting the workers with a virtual town hall on food worker safety with presumptive Democratic presidential candidate Joe Biden and calling for meatless May Mondays.
We have been advocating for workers' rights in these meatpacking facilities for many years. And we knew that when this virus arrived, because of those conditions, we were going to have a major issue.
As meatpacking workers face increasingly dire conditions, we'll also look at how Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell is demanding Congress protect corporations from liability for workers who get sick with the coronavirus. And as the United States represents close to 1/3 of confirmed cases, we'll speak with emergency room physician Dr. Richard Levitan, who volunteered at Bellevue Hospital in New York at the height of the COVID-19 surge, shocked by what he saw. He says we could be doing more to keep patients off ventilators and alive. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. There are now over 3.5 million confirmed cases of the coronavirus around the world, with nearly 250,000 reported deaths. The United States makes up close to 1/3 of confirmed cases and 1/4 of the known deaths, even though it represents less than 5% of the world's population. President Trump has projected the U.S. death toll from COVID-19 may top 100,000. Revising statements he made in recent weeks, putting the projected number as low as 50,000. The official U.S. death toll is around 68,000 now, but many researchers believe the actual number is far higher. On Friday, over 2,900 people died, a new daily high in the United States. Here in New York, a nursing home has reported a staggering 98 resident deaths linked to the coronavirus. Until Friday, the official number of coronavirus deaths reported by New York for the facility was 13. The Isabella Geriatric Center said it had to order a refrigerator truck to store dead bodies because overburdened funeral homes had been taking days to pick them up. In Washington, D.C., President Trump and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo are continuing to criticize China's handling of the coronavirus outbreak, claiming the virus originated in a Chinese lab. On Sunday, Pompeo appeared on ABC This Week.
There's enormous evidence that that's where this began. We've said from the beginning that this was a virus that originated in Wuhan, China. We took a lot of grief for that from the outset, but I think the whole world can see now. Remember, China has a history of infecting the world, and they have a history of running substandard laboratories.
The World Health Organization and the U.S. intelligence community have refuted this theory, saying the coronavirus was not man-made and originated from animal-to-human transmission. A recent Department of Homeland Security report also blames the Chinese government for intentionally concealing the severity of the coronavirus while stockpiling imported supplies and reducing its exports. Meanwhile, the White House has blocked Dr. Anthony Fauci from testifying before a House committee this week. Trump is also moving to oust the Inspector General of the Department of Health and Human Services, Christy Grimm. She recently detailed how hospitals were facing severe shortages of medical supplies and tests. U.S. senators are returning to work in Washington, D.C. after Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell insisted on resuming in-person business, despite the objections of some lawmakers. The House of Representatives is not returning to D.C. this week. Washington, D.C. is considered a coronavirus hotspot. Minority Leader Chuck Schumer blasted the Republican agenda for precipitating lawmakers' return, tweeting, quote, Senate Republicans should be laser-focused on the health and economic crises caused by COVID-19, not confirming right-wing judges or protecting big business from legal liability, unquote. For the first time ever, the Supreme Court will hear 2 cases by phone. All of the justices will be on a conference call with the lawyers in the 2 cases. The public will also be able to listen to the arguments live for the first time ever. In New York City, cell phone video has gone viral showing police officers aggressively pinning a black man to the ground as they arrested him, then violently attacking a passerby, also black, dragging him on the street, punching him, and kneeling on his neck during what was supposed to be a social distancing enforcement action. The witness who took the video in the East Village said police falsely accused the first man and a woman of violating social distancing rules before going after the passerby. At least some of the officers involved in the attack were not wearing protective face masks as required in New York when social distancing is not possible. Over 1,000 New York police officers were dispatched over the weekend to enforce social distancing rules. Photos emerged on social media over the weekend of crowded parks and other public spaces as New Yorkers left their homes to take advantage of the warmer weather. In immigration news, the San Diego Union Tribune reports 2 guards at the privately owned Otay Mesa Detention Center have filed 2 lawsuits against Core Civic, alleging the private for-profit prison corporation doesn't take the necessary measures to protect their health on the COVID-19 amidst the pandemic and create an environment that was too dangerous for them to do their jobs. Otay Mesa has one of the largest coronavirus outbreaks of any ICE jail in the United States. As of last week, over 160 prisoners have tested positive for COVID-19. Over half of U.S. states have relaxed or are preparing to loosen social distancing and other restrictions, but some businesses are pushing back. In Georgia, more than 120 Atlanta restaurants have refused to open, saying it is not safe to do so, despite Georgia Governor Brian Kemp's lifting of the state's shelter-in-place order. In Europe, Spain continues to ease restrictions, allowing adults to go outside for exercise as its daily death toll hit its lowest number in over 6 weeks Sunday, with just over 160 deaths. The total reported death toll is over 25,000. Spain is letting people go outside in shifts based on their demographic groups to ensure social distancing measures can be respected. Italy reported its lowest daily death toll Sunday since the start of its lockdown, the longest lockdown of any country so far. Meanwhile, in Britain, the lockdown continues. Over 28,000 people have died from the coronavirus there, according to official reports, making it the European country with the second most known deaths, just behind Italy. Russia reported over 10,000 new cases Sunday, its 4th record single-day increase in a row. Russia is now reporting over 134,000 cases and 1,300 deaths. In Afghanistan, health officials warn the new coronavirus could be spreading at an alarming rate after a small study suggested about a third of residents in the capital, Kabul, could be infected. So far, Afghanistan has not been among countries most severely affected by the virus. At least 2,700 cases and 85 deaths have been confirmed, but the true numbers are expected to be much higher as testing remains limited. This comes as a new report by Save the Children finds over 7 million children in Afghanistan are at risk of hunger. Millions were already facing food shortages, but the coronavirus caused food shortages to soar and strip many day laborers of their livelihoods. Save the Children said, quote, "We're deeply concerned that this pandemic will lead to a perfect storm of hunger, disease, and death in Afghanistan until the world takes action now." India has extended its nationwide lockdown, affecting 1.3 billion people for another 2 weeks after reporting a record rate of new coronavirus cases. On Friday, India rolled out a contact tracing app that uses Bluetooth and location services to track people's movements. Use of the app will be mandatory for all public and private sector workers. The Internet Freedom Foundation warns the app is a privacy minefield that could become a permanent surveillance tool even after the pandemic recedes. In Pakistan, medical workers have ended a hunger strike after the government agreed to ensure that each worker has access to personal protective equipment. The government also promised to investigate the death of a nurse who developed COVID-19 symptoms after treating coronavirus patients. Dozens of starving Rohingya refugees landed on the southern coast of Bangladesh Sunday as fears grow for hundreds more left stranded at sea for weeks after Bangladeshi authorities cut off port access during the coronavirus pandemic. In April, more than 60 Rohingya died aboard a boat with hundreds of refugees on board after authorities in Malaysia and Thailand denied them entry, citing coronavirus fears. The United Nations is calling on governments to allow Rohingya fleeing persecution in Burma to dock as weather forecasters warn a tropical cyclone may form over the Bay of Bengal this week. In South Africa, police clashed with healthcare workers in Johannesburg Friday as they held a protest demanding better worker conditions, including adequate personal protective equipment while treating COVID-19 patients. This is a nurse from the Soweto township.
President, you haven't come to the nursing profession. Are you waiting until there's death of nurses or death of our communities to start responding actively to the nurses' plight and the nurses' control?
Protests took place across the United States and around the world Friday for May Day. Despite the pandemic, essential workers from Amazon, Instacart, Whole Foods, Walmart, Target, and FedEx held a mass strike to demand better health and safety conditions and hazard pay. In Washington, D.C., the People's Bailout Motorcade rolled through the city. Around the country, nurses at well over 100 hospitals held socially distanced protests demanding personal protective equipment and to draw attention to healthcare workers who have died while fighting the coronavirus. In Fredericksburg, Pennsylvania, over 30 cars circled the Bell & Elvin's poultry processing plant to demand they shut down the facility until worker protections can be guaranteed. At least 2 COVID-19 deaths and dozens of infections have been linked to that plant alone. Here in New York City, protesters took part in a car caravan to call for worker protections and economic protections. The caravan passed in front of New York Governor Andrew Cuomo's Manhattan office and the penthouse apartment of Amazon CEO Jeff Bezos. In Times Square, demonstrators laid out body bags to represent victims of COVID-19. This is Perla Liberato, an activist with Make the Road New York.
A lot of people are struggling with rent right now. People are not able to pay rent. A lot of people are not working, especially undocumented folks are not receiving any kind of money to be able to survive in this pandemic. So we want to make sure the rent is canceled until we know what's going to happen next.
Meanwhile, in San Francisco, 2 unhoused activists briefly took over a vacant house before being forced to leave Friday after police threatened to remove them by force. Activists with Reclaim San Francisco protested the heavy police presence in front of the house, which is said to be an investment property that's been sitting empty for years. At least one person at the protest was arrested. This is Cooper Arona speaking from inside the house before being forced to leave.
We're San Francisco, right? We're supposed to take care of each other. We're supposed to take care of each other, and we're not doing that. London Bridge is so far away from anything that is reality to us. It's like, it makes me feel lost, and I feel alone. I feel scared and alone in my own city, and that's unfair. And now I got all these guys right here on overtime, and here I am, like, still without a house.
To see an extended interview with Cooper before the pandemic, go to democracynow.org. That occupation was one of several actions that took place across San Francisco Friday for May Day, including a cancel rent car caravan. North and South Korean troops briefly exchanged gunfire Sunday across the demilitarized zone. separating the two Koreas. It was the first skirmish at the DMZ since North Korean troops fired on a defector in 2017. This came days after North Korean leader Kim Jong-un appeared publicly Friday for the first time in almost 3 weeks, touring a newly completed fertilizer factory near Pyongyang. Kim's appearance followed weeks of speculation about his health and put an end to rumors he was gravely ill after surgery. Canada's banning military-style assault firearms, including the AR-15, 2 weeks after a gunman in Nova Scotia killed 22 people during a 12-hour rampage, the worst mass shooting in Canadian history. This is Prime Minister Justin Trudeau speaking Friday.
We are closing the market for military-grade assault weapons in Canada. We are banning 1,500 models and variants of these firearms by way of regulations. These weapons were designed for one purpose and one purpose only: to kill the largest number of people in the shortest amount of time.
Families of the victims deserve more than thoughts and prayers, said Prime Minister Trudeau as he announced the new measures. The Venezuelan government's claiming it's foiled a coup attempt after 10 armed men landed in a boat in a port city near Caracas. Venezuelan authorities killed 8 of the men who they described as mercenary terrorists. 2 men were captured. A former U.S. Green Beret claimed the attack was part of a wider attempt to overthrow the Venezuelan government. In other news from Venezuela, at least 46 prisoners have died in a riot that began after prisoners reportedly attempted to escape an overcrowded prison. Amnesty International is calling for an investigation into the deaths and prison authorities' quote, lethal response to the unrest. In Kenya, over 1,800 families have lost their homes in recent days as heavy rains trigger massive flooding in western Kenya. Rains have been pounding the region for weeks, killing over 100 people in floods and landslides. This is a displaced resident.
It has been flooding for 3 days now. I think the government is not even aware, but now we are telling them. We're asking if there are any plans to assist us. Only 2 boats are here for evacuating people.
Valentina Blackhorse, a prominent figure in Navajo Nation as the winner of multiple pageants, has died at the age of 28 from COVID-19. Valentina Blackhorse was a beloved community leader who promoted Navajo culture and education. Her sister says she had hoped to enter politics in the future. Valentina Blackhorse may have contracted the virus while caring for her partner, Robbie Jones, a detention officer for the Navajo Department of Corrections, who says he could have been exposed at work. She died just 1 day after her coronavirus test came back positive. Navajo Nation has been hard hit by the pandemic, reporting over 2,000 cases of COVID-19 and at least 70 deaths. And today marks the 50th anniversary of the Kent State shootings. On May 4th, 1970, National Guardsmen opened fire on hundreds of unarmed students at an anti-war rally at Kent State University in Ohio, killing 4 students and wounding 9 others. Kent State is holding a virtual commemoration today on their website. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. When we come back, we'll speak with the CEO of LULAC, a Latino organization standing up for meatpackers. Over 5,000 have tested positive. At least 20 are dead. Stay with us. Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, a song written in response to the day 50 years ago today, May 4th, 1970, National Guardsmen opened fire on hundreds of unarmed students at an anti-war rally at Kent State University in Ohio, killing 4 students and wounding 9 others. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We begin today's show looking at the coronavirus outbreak in meatpacking plants across the United States, as U.S. beef, pork, and poultry processing plants face a public health crisis and a growing number of infected workers. Last week, President Trump signed an executive order barring governments from closing meat plants. The order declares meat plants as critical infrastructure. At least 20 meatpacking workers have died from COVID-19. More than 5,000 have fallen ill from the disease. That number is expected to be far higher due to a lack of testing. In Sioux Falls, South Dakota, at least 1,000 people have tested positive for the virus at one Smithfield pork plant, accounting for more than half the confirmed cases in the entire state of South Dakota. At least 6 workers at a JBS beef packing plant in Greeley, Colorado, have died from COVID-19. Despite this, the plant reopened last week after a short closure without testing all its workers. And the Tyson Columbus Junction processing plant in Iowa reopened in late April despite the deaths of 2 workers from COVID-19. A meat worker from the Tyson plant spoke to Democracy Now! About conditions there during the pandemic. She's an immigrant from Guanajuato, Mexico, and asked to remain anonymous out of fear of retaliation.
There was a young man that I know was still going to work, even though he said he had been sick for 2 weeks. I don't know why Tyson didn't detect that people who were sick were still going to work. This only made things worse. Later, I realized that a lot of people at that plant were infected. A man who had worked there died, and there were a lot of people in critical condition at the hospital. I'm not sure if they're still there because, truthfully, I haven't left my house or spoken to anyone recently, so I'm not sure of what the status of their health is. But I know many people were at the hospital in critical condition, and they are all people who work at Tyson.
President Trump's executive order to keep meat plants running has sparked outrage over what it means for workers being forced to work in unsafe conditions. On Friday, dozens of Bell & Evans workers and activists circled the poultry company's Lebanon County, Pennsylvania poultry processing plant in a funeral caravan after 2 COVID-19 deaths and dozens of infections connected to the plant. The protesters demanded an immediate shutdown of the plant and full pay for all workers until it can implement a plan to keep workers safe, including personal protective equipment, paid sick time, and social distancing policies.
Bell & Evans has gone radio silent while their workers die. That's unacceptable. We demand Bell & Evans to tell us how many workers are infected and how many workers have died. We need to know how many other workers have been infected by the failures of this company.
Over the weekend, LULAC, that's the League of United Latin American Citizens, joined a coalition of Iowa farmers, activists, workers, and elected officials and community groups to announce the Meatless May Mondays campaign to draw attention to the conditions workers are facing. Today, LULAC, which has more than 60 million members countrywide, is joining with Univision to host a virtual town hall on food worker safety with Democratic presidential candidate Joe Biden and members of Congress. Well, for more, we're joined by a number of guests. In Washington, D.C., Cindy Benavides is with us, CEO of LULAC. And in Des Moines, Iowa, we'll start with Alejandro, a local organizer whose immediate and extended family members work in meatpacking plants across Iowa, South Dakota, and Nebraska, including Smithfield, Tyson, and other meat plants. Alejandro has asked us to use his first name only out of concern for retaliation retaliation against his family. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Cindy Benavides, we're beginning with you, CEO of LULAC. I watched your news conference on Friday, where you're joining with this coalition of groups calling for meatless May Mondays, a kind of boycott of these meat corporations. This as President Trump has invoked the Defense Production Act, signing an executive order saying governments cannot close down these hot spots where in some cases, one meat packing plant alone, there are over 700 coronavirus positive workers. Can you talk about LULAC's position and what you understand about the meat packing industry in this country and who the meat packers are?
First of all, thank you so much, Amy, for having me on. As many of you may know, LULAC, the League of United Latin American Citizens, is the oldest and largest national Latino civil rights organization. We're about 91 years young, 91 years strong, and still going. For 91 years, we have been protecting and defending the Latino community in the United States, in Puerto Rico, and Washington, D.C. And today, unfortunately, we find ourselves still protecting and defending our community, particular our meatpacking workers. What we're seeing on the ground and how we're made up is that we have members who are volunteers for LULAC in over 37 states, Washington, D.C., and Puerto Rico. And some of those members happen to work in meatpacking plants and or are relatives of folks that work in meatpacking plants. And this is why over a month ago, we started receiving complaints of individuals who were hearing that, unfortunately, their colleagues were getting sick, and this was not being reported by that particular industry or facility. And so we got involved, and over a month ago, we sent a letter to OSHA to ask for questions. To this day, we have not heard back. We have not gotten a response. We also know that our LULAC members in Iowa, our state director, Nick Salazar, and Joe Henry, who serves as a senior advisor to our national president, have been working closely with our community in Iowa and also traveling to neighboring states to understand the conditions of the workers. And just to give you an idea, in Columbus Junction, Iowa, we know that there's already been multiple deaths there of people working. And what we're seeing more than that is that when President Trump enacted the Defense Production Act, what he is asking our community to do is to march into slaughterhouses and put their lives on the line. What he is doing is in a lack of acknowledgement and completely voiding and annulling a person's right to work in a safe place. We know that more than 20,000 individuals have been impacted, have cases of COVID-19, and that there's over 20 deaths that have occurred. However, we feel that these estimates are highly undercounted. We think that it's at least double, if not triple, those numbers. And again, what we're hearing from the workers and from their families is that in many instances, the workers are being turned away by the clinics and hospitals in their community, and they're having to drive over an hour and a half or 2 hours simply to get tested, and on top, pay for the tests in order to know if they actually do have COVID cases.
Alejandro, if you could describe your family, what they face, the plants they live in, that they work in.
Definitely, and thanks for having me, Amy. Essentially, in the surrounding area here in Iowa, there are countless meat and food processing plants, and we're seeing that these issues are across the board. This is industry-wide practices, and that's why we're seeing this, kind of pop up all over the state, essentially. And as you mentioned, I have family working across the board, across the state, and into some other states in the industry. So, this is, it's very scary for my family, my immediate family, my extended family. I have cousins who now have tested positive, because of these plants. My sister and her husband have tested positive here just recently because of these plants. And, again, just incredibly scared. And this has just been consistent, even prior to the epidemic, that these have not been safe work conditions. Very fast lines. These are workers that are standing on their feet for hours. overworked, working extended hours in a day and working often forced weekends. So these are very hard workers that are very dedicated to that work to provide for their families. But the only reason that they aren't there right now, why these companies, many of them are have a lot less workers right now, is because they're scared. They want to do the work. I've been talking to families, to workers almost every day for the last couple of weeks, and they've been telling me that they want to work, but they want to be able to do it safely. So, just even 2 weeks ago is when they finally started introducing masks, not that they're very protective masks, but they started introducing masks just 2 weeks ago, even though we've known about what's been going on for months. So it's very clear that these companies, that they didn't take the safety precautions, and essentially they have a system in place that doesn't prioritize the safety of workers, which is largely why we're seeing all of this. Again, they talk.
I wanted to read what John Tyson, the billionaire chair of the board of Tyson Foods, recently warned in a full-page ad in several newspapers, as well on the company's website. Quote, "There will be limited supply of our products available in grocery stores until we're able to reopen our facilities that are currently closed. The food supply chain is breaking," he said. It wasn't days later that the president, President Trump, invoking the Defense Production Act, said that no government, no governor could shut down a plant. But is it the coronavirus that is breaking the food supply, or is it these corporations that did not early on provide the PPE, the protective gear that workers needed, the social distancing required? Alejandro, I wanted to put that question to you. And also, if you can talk about right now as we're broadcasting, Univision is having a special where they are bringing on different workers, like one of your colleagues, yet another daughter or son of workers in the plants. If you could talk about your organization, you speak English, you're a kind of a translator for your families who are working and getting sick in the plants.
Definitely. And, in terms of, what the Tyson's had said there in regards to, the food supply chain, I think that's something that a lot of us are seeing. Of course, I'm concerned about, being able to feed America, and so are the workers. But if that was truly what they prioritized, if what they were prioritizing was, in ensuring that we have a food supply chain, essentially, then they would be making sure that the workers are able to do their job safely, and they're not doing that. And it's kind of sad to see even other leaders, blaming the workers for, the immigrants for what's going on, when it's very clear that it is because they didn't take these safety precautions, because of the culture where they're encouraging people to come in or not letting them go home when they're sick. It's because of these long existing practices that and this structure, this dynamic between leadership and workers, where workers don't have a voice. That largely feeds into why, as you mentioned, it's the children of the workers. I was seeing that a lot of people in my similar situation, which is my cousins, my siblings, my former classmates from high school. We were kind of just screaming out to the void. We were afraid for our parents. There really wasn't much, talk there. There wasn't any noise. So, I did create a group where we were able to come together, the families and, the community, different allies to start, bringing awareness, start addressing what's going on, talking to workers and really identifying what they need. Because, again, I'm not here to speak on behalf and tell them, tell you what they need. I'm just here to say that these workers need a voice, and, these executive orders, these different things that, say, Mitch McConnell and other leaders are, touting are essentially just finding new ways to limit that voice. These workers don't have protections. These companies aren't being held accountable, and they're not even taking responsibility. So that makes it even harder to be accountable. And having a situation where workers can't even take legal action, or the communities can't rally around and force governments to, take this seriously.
And we're going to talk about that issue of corporate responsibility. The Senate Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell, holding up stimulus package 4 until he can get inserted into it, that corporations are not responsible for what happens during COVID. But before we do that and also speak with Rob Weissman, head of Public Citizen, let's turn again to the Tyson processing plant worker in Columbus Junction, Iowa, who spoke to Democracy Now! But asked we not use her name because of fear of retaliation. She said this is her message to Tyson and other meat industry corporations.
I would like it if they treated people with more respect, with more love, to be considerate of us, the people who are working there out of necessity. We're not there for them to destroy our lives or our bodies. They need to be more conscious of taking care of people. It is because of the people that they are able to do what they do. Why not take care of people? Why not make sure we don't get hurt? I've never liked this, that they don't pay any attention to people's well-being. They should be more humane. Don't just think about money, but think about the workers that are helping the company make that money.
In an interview with BuzzFeed News, a Smithfield Foods spokesperson blamed the South Dakota plant's, quote, large immigrant population for the rapid spread of the coronavirus. The spokesperson explained, quote, living circumstances in certain cultures are different than they are with your traditional American family. I wanted to go back to Cindy Benavides to respond to this, the CEO of LULAC.
Thank you, Amy. And, first and foremost, I can certainly understand the pain that our community is feeling and the fear. And Alejandro talked about this. There's so many in our community who have reached out to LULAC, given us only their first name or a different name for fear of retaliation. And we also know that, many of them are being told internally that if they are not at work, they will not get paid, and or worse, that they could get fired, even when some of these same companies are touting externally that they're willing to pay the workers additional money or give them bonuses. So which one is it? Is it one, the managers internally telling the workers that they will get fired and or not get paid if they get sick? Or is it really what's being publicized externally? I can tell you, when we look at this particular industry, you have to really look at it from the very beginning to end. Yes, many of the workers actually commute in together to work to the plants. Many of them also, like many Americans, have multi-generational homes where you may have the parents, the children, and or the grandparents in the same household. And I know that this is not only true to Latinos, but it's also true to many immigrant and American families across this country. More worrisome is the fact that some of these facilities, even more than a month ago, when they started seeing the cases pop up, did not take the urgent steps to make sure that the workers were protected, making sure that they had protection gear in place. And I just want Americans to stop for a minute. For all of us who go to the grocery store and for, the 1 hour or 2 hours that we're wearing that face mask, it's so uncomfortable. Can you just imagine workers who are working for 8 to 10 to 12 plus hours? We know because there have been so many incidents of COVID cases that our workers are being asked to work even longer shifts or work additional shifts. And we know this from different members across the country. In fact, our state director, Madai, her father, who has worked in this industry for over 30 years, reported that he's having to work and pick up shifts involuntarily at times to make sure that the production keeps going. And so what are we asking? We are asking the companies to put safety measures in place to make sure that there are longer breaks so you don't have a line of people waiting at the restroom close together. We're asking them to put sneeze guards, plastics in between workers, and to make sure that they in fact are following CDC and OSHA guidelines in terms of social distancing. And here's one more thing. We also know that in various facilities across this country, in many facilities, there are workers who may speak more than 40 different languages
privileges. And so it's not enough to put a poster up on a wall that says, please practice social distancing 6 feet apart. If you don't explain it, if you don't have the education awareness about what social distancing is, and in fact, even making sure that the shifts are staggered and that the breaks are staggered. Oftentimes where people sit to eat, they're eating elbow to elbow. Where they are working, they're elbow to elbow, oftentimes even not having the ventilation that's required for them to be in a safe place. And so as we hear of the companies, and the different cases that have occurred, again, our ask is very simple. Please make sure that the workers are in a safe place where they don't feel like they're walking or marching into a slaughterhouse and their life is on the line. What we're asking is, if you had your child or your parent or your sibling working in that same line, would you not want them to have the safety conditions so that they don't feel afraid to walk into work and think that they will unfortunately come down with a COVID case and potentially die? We are asking for basic protections at work that help our community to keep the line flowing, to make sure that all of Americans are able to enjoy meat and pork and poultry. We stand with the workers. We want to make sure that all workers across America, but particularly our workers who are facing high cases of COVID cases due to the lack of safety, are protected. And so with that, Amy, I will tell you that this is a difficult situation. We understand that there's political games at play here. We understand that there's an election coming. But the bottom line is that the slow reaction by the federal government, the slow reaction by corporations, and the lack of action have placed people's lives on the line, and we've already had multiple deaths.
We want to thank you so much for being with us, and we are not leaving the story here. Cindy Benavides, CEO of LULAC, and Alejandro, an organizer in Iowa whose immediate and extended family members work in meatpacking plants. When we come back, we're going to speak with a guest who will talk about this demand by the Senate Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell, to absolve corporations of any responsibility during the pandemic. We'll speak with Public Citizens head Rob Weissman. Stay with us. No Discrimination by the great Tony Allen and Africa 70. Allen is the drummer who created the beat of Afrobeat. He died last week at the age of 79. This is Democracy Now!, the Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As meat packers around the U.S. face increasingly dire conditions, overwhelmingly immigrant and people of color, Republican lawmakers are ramping up their defense of corporate interests in the companies where workers are falling ill. The Senate reconvenes today. Majority Leader Mitch McConnell's demanding Congress use the next stimulus bill to protect corporations from liability from workers who get sick with the coronavirus. This is McConnell speaking on Fox News.
We have brave healthcare workers battling this virus, entrepreneurs who reopen their economy, all of whom deserve, in my view, strong protections from the opportunistic lawsuits that are being planned all over America. All over America. The lawyers, trial lawyers are sharpening their pencils to come after the healthcare providers and businesses arguing that somehow the decision they made with regard to reopening adversely affected the health of someone else.
Democrats have said they'll oppose McConnell's push for widespread corporate immunity. For more, we're joined by Rob Weissman, president of Public Citizen. Robert Weissman, thanks so much for joining us. We've been talking about the meat packers. Of course, this extends beyond the meat plants. But can you talk about what Mitch McConnell is demanding? And is he actually holding the Stimulus 4 package up to insert this in?
Mitch McConnell is talking about trying to have total immunity for big corporations for really anything that's remotely connected to the coronavirus crisis. He's reconvening the Senate today, he says, for the purpose of granting immunity to big corporations, and he says he won't let the next stimulus/relief bill go through unless it includes provisions to protect big corporations from lawsuits. This is not just about, although it's especially about, protecting employers from lawsuits for endangering their workers. It's also about lawsuits protecting companies from endangering their workers. It probably means protecting corporations from lawsuits over environmental pollution, maybe even violations of the civil rights law, fair wage law, and even more. This is a long-term agenda of the Chamber of Commerce and big business. Mitch McConnell sees an opportunity with the coronavirus to capitalize, and he's trying to get broad immunity for corporations for all the kinds of wrongdoing they might commit during the period of the crisis.
So talk about exactly what this would mean. I mean, when a corporation stays open, like one of these meatpacking plants, where they're not provided, the workers are not provided with the proper protective gear, they often, for months, have not had tests, but if they don't come to work, they'll be fired. So their livelihoods are at stake. They have no recourse?
Well, that's what McConnell would like. So, in fact, for workers don't have much recourse anyway for dangers at the workplace. If you're injured or become ill at the workplace, you're entitled to workers' compensation. It's just a straight insurance system. So you get paid for your time off, some portion, and compensation for your health care and any injury you may suffer. But you can't sue companies in court normally. The only time you can sue a company in court for an injury or exposure to an illness is when they engage in egregious misconduct, reckless endangerment of the workers. So when McConnell says he wants to protect the companies from lawsuits, he mostly means he wants to protect their right to engage in egregious misconduct. There's one case that's going on right now in Missouri that's slightly different, involving meatpacking workers. There, the workers are not suing for money damages. They're suing for injunctive relief to force the Smithfield meatpacking plant to adopt the sensible minimal standards needed to protect workers who are going to be required to go to work, to give them the protective equipment they need, to make sure there's adequate sanitation, extended breaks, that they get adequate sick leave, that there's testing, and crucially, that there's sufficient distancing at the production line. That's the lawsuit that is the primary one that the companies and Mitch McConnell are focusing on. It doesn't even ask for any money. It only asks Smithfield to protect its workers.
So Trump's executive order gives these plants, does it give them legal immunity? Can you talk about, well, Mother Jones had this piece saying hours before publishing her Bloomberg story, reporter Jennifer Jacobs asked Trump what steps he would take to bolster the food supply under strain from COVID-19. His answer focused on the meat industry, in particular Tyson Foods. He told us he will do an EO, executive order, to help Tyson Foods with the liability problem. Rob Weissman.
Right. So Trump did issue an executive order talking about the central importance of meat production to the U.S. food supply. It does not, in fact, confer immunity on corporations, and Trump cannot do that under existing law on his own. It does say companies should, if they're sued, invoke his executive order and say, see, the president says we have to stay open. And in fact, Smithfield is doing that now in the Missouri case. But it does not give them immunity. For them to get immunity, they're going to need a law passed by Congress, and that's exactly what Mitch McConnell is trying to do.
Rob Weissman, I want to thank you for being with us, president of Public Citizen. And, of course, we'll come back to you on many other issues. As we turn now to our last segment, this is Democracy Now!, the Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As we look at the effort to save more lives as the coronavirus pandemic continues to rage across the United States and around the world. Even as President Trump presses states to begin reopening, he predicted Sunday the U.S. death toll from the pandemic could reach 100,000, a number far higher than his earlier estimate a week or two ago of 60,000. We're joined now by Richard Levitan, an emergency physician who's usually based in Littleton, New Hampshire, but he came down to New York to volunteer at one of the public hospitals, at Bellevue Hospital, where my dad used to work in Manhattan, for 10 days at the height of the COVID-19 surge in April. He was shocked by what he saw. He wrote about what he learned in the New York Times op-ed headlined "The Infection That's Silently Killing Coronavirus Patients." In it, he writes, "I realize we're not detecting the deadly pneumonia the virus causes early enough and that we could be doing more to keep patients off ventilators and alive." Dr. Levitan, if you could tell us how exactly you do that. Welcome.
Thank you for having me. For the last 30 years in medicine, we have used a fifth vital sign. So the standard vital signs of heart rate, blood pressure, temperature, respiratory rate. We've added a fifth vital sign. That fifth vital sign is pulse oximetry. And what it does is it measures the saturation of oxygen in the blood. And what I noticed while working in New York is these patients came in with alarmingly low oxygen saturations, but they did not subjectively actually feel short of breath.
So explain this oximeter. Explain exactly what it is. And interestingly, the inventor of the oximeter, Takuo Oyagi, an ingenious and indispensable medical device, as many are describing it, just died, and his death was just announced.
Yeah, so if you've interacted with the healthcare system at all in the last 30 years, you had a small probe placed on your finger. In the hospital, those probes connect up to our monitors, but there are also now fingertip versions of this, and these devices are very inexpensive, and they are widely available. They are present already on every ambulance, in every hospital, in every doctor's office, actually in every nursing home. They exist widely. And this device gives you two numbers. It gives you a heart rate and it gives you an oxygen saturation. And so what is remarkable about this is that the cause of death in COVID overwhelmingly is pneumonia. Pneumonia triggers hospitalization and often requirements for mechanical ventilation. And then all these problems ensue after the lungs get severely injured. And a pulse oximeter is just a measure of identifying how well the lungs are working. And I believe can be basically an early warning system in terms of patients to know who has COVID pneumonia.
So describe what doctors all over the country and nurses are seeing in hospitals, something that they really haven't seen before, where someone will be on their cell phone, they'll be talking to the doctors and nurses, and then suddenly crash. Explain that, and then talk also about your concern about people being put on ventilators. What, at this point, something like 85% of people who've been put on ventilators die?
So the rate of death on ventilators varies dramatically. And unfortunately, the public has the perception that everybody who gets put on a ventilator dies. It really depends how sick you are on presentation. If you are elderly, if your lungs are terribly involved, your mortality being put on a ventilator is high. But among young people, actually, the death rate on ventilators is much lower. So I don't want the public to be scared that, if their loved one winds up on a ventilator, that necessarily means a death sentence. But it is a bad thing when people get COVID pneumonia and they present late. In terms of their presentation, we see all the time in emergency medicine that when people choke, when they drown, anything that affects oxygen going to the brain, when that happens quickly, patients pass out or they have seizures. The remarkable thing about these patients are they come in with oximetry readings, pulse oximetry readings, oxygen saturation readings, half normal, as low as 50%. And we normally have an oxygen saturation between 94 and 100. But so these people are there with these incredibly low readings, and their brain is working fine, and they're on their cell phone. And what they have done as an adaptation to this low oxygen caused by the pneumonia is they have silently kind of increased their breathing rate over days. And they only come in when they get either short of breath or a fever, but that happens, late in the process. Subjective shortness of breath is not something that the patients appreciate because this disease basically silently advances until they get seriously ill.
And so you're saying when people are told do not go into the emergency room before you have that shortness of breath, just stay at home, can be a real problem, that people are holding off to the end when it could be too late.
Well, looking back on my own experience with COVID, before I went to New York and I was evaluating patients in the hospital and we were sending out COVID tests, I followed what the CDC guidance was. I told patients, let us know if you get short of breath. There are, in fact, posters from the CDC that say, do not go to the hospital if you have a cough or you have shortness of breath. Only go to the hospital if you have trouble breathing, you're unable to be awoken, or you turn blue. Well, in hindsight, what I now appreciate is that a very, very small number of patients have subjective shortness of breath. When they do get short of breath, they're really ill. So the public messaging needs to change. The public needs to know that earlier diagnosis, identification that you have COVID, and then monitoring with one of these little devices can warn you about the need to return and be hospitalized. And if you come in earlier, we can do much better treating your pneumonia, identifying how much inflammation there is, getting drugs into you, and other things.
Dr. Richard Levitan, you are incredibly brave to come from this rural area in New Hampshire to New York, come back to where you grew up, but to Bellevue, a city hospital, to say you want to offer your services. We know the kind of threat you yourself put yourself in, the kind of dangerous situation. And so many doctors, nurses, staffers at hospital, the people who clean up are in that kind of situation every day. And yet when you came to New York to offer your services, can you describe what happened when you found a place to stay, your brother's apartment, what the building did?
Yeah, so I got kicked out of my brother's apartment when they found out I was working at Bellevue. But, let me just say that the people in New York City, the frontline healthcare workers, my friends in emergency medicine departments around the city, they were in this fight for weeks before I arrived. They're still in this fight now. I spent 10 days. The heroes here are the people who are in this for the long haul.
Right, but I just want to point out, here we are based in New York City in this epicenter of the pandemic. The building, the co-op that your brother is in, they kicked you out because you were a doctor who came in and were working at Bellevue? They said you couldn't stay there?
So this pandemic, this virus has scared a lot of people. And, as it turns out, that's what landed me in a story in the New York Times. But what ended up happening over the course of my 10 days was this amazing transformation in care that over time, we learned that a lot of patients with severe COVID pneumonia could actually be managed without ventilators. And that realization actually led me to recontact Jim Dwyer at the New York Times, who had done the first article about me. And he subsequently produced an incredible article along with Robin Stein, who had an incredible video discussing what doctors wish they'd known a month ago. And what it ended up doing was kind of explaining how dramatically practice has changed. And, this is a great message for the public to understand.
We have 10 seconds. 10 seconds.
Anyway,
go ahead, Dr. Levitan.
So, but 2 out of 3 patients who we now see with COVID pneumonia, we can manage without ventilators.
Well, we'll link to Jim Dwyer's piece and your own op-ed piece. Dr. Richard Levitan, thank you for coming to New York to help us here. Dr. Levitan is an emergency physician in Littleton, New Hampshire, volunteered at Bellevue Hospital, a public hospital in New York, for 10 days at the height of the COVID-19 surge in April. That does it for our show. A very happy birthday to Dennis Moynihan. Democracy Now! Is working with as few people on site as possible. The majority of our amazing team is working from home. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks so much for joining us. Stay safe.